Hey, welcome to the Utah Stories program. My name is Richard Markosian. So, all throughout the month of May, we are focusing on wellness. We're doing this with our wellness issue of Utah Stories. In the magazine, we're focusing on urban gardening, food as medicine, how to choose a doctor, healthy places to eat. It's a really great issue, but in tandem with this issue, we're talking to health and wellness experts, and we're also tackling some of the bigger problems in Utah related to health and wellness. So in this episode of the podcast, we're talking to Kim Myers, who is from the Utah State Department of Health and Human Services, and we're talking about suicide. Why should we talk about suicide? Because it is quickly becoming one of the most common forms of death for people under the age of 40. And it's especially growing exponentially in Utah. And so the Wall Street Journal recently did a report about Utah and Eagle Mountain and pointed out how one single high school had 5 suicides in 1 year. Kids were just killing themselves, and it's a terrible tragedy. And a lot of the kids were like model students, straight A students. And I find this issue very fascinating because it's something our mainstream local media doesn't really want to cover or delve into or ask the question of how and why. Of course, they'll report it happened. As usual, we want to go into the how and the why. And so without further ado, my interview with Kim Myers. All right, with me on the Utah Stories program today is Kim Myers, who is the Suicide Prevention Coordinator for the Utah Department of Human Services. Thanks for being on the show with me.
Thank you for having me.
So explain to me your job and how it was created in 2013 and how Utah is responding to the suicide, I guess you could call it something of an epidemic we've had, especially among teenagers.
So in 2013, or just before the legislative session in 2013, one of our state lawmakers had a constituent, a teenager come and say, we've had several suicides in our school and nobody's talking about it and nobody's doing anything. And he started to sort of look into what was going on. At the same time, my boss at the Division of Substance Abuse and Mental Health had gathered stakeholders to write a new state suicide prevention plan because we had a really outdated and old one. So those two sort of things came together to say, well, we need somebody who really is dedicated to this, who can help sort of organize efforts and coordinate efforts and provide sort of technical assistance and guidance to communities, to families, to organizations to tackle the problem of suicide in Utah and build up our suicide prevention strategies. And so the legislature passed a bill that funded positions to do that. And so we have had that position since, July of 2013.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going on almost 6 years.
And what's your background in? How did you get this particular position?
So my background is in social work. So I'm a social worker. I've also worked a lot in sort of community organizing. And so around how do you bring diverse stakeholders, groups who maybe voices aren't always well represented at the table together to do the best possible, find the best possible solutions. Mm-hmm. So, and then, I've also had personal experiences with suicide myself and lost important people to me. And so I was given the opportunity to serve in this position, and it really spoke to me as this is an opportunity to not only use my skill set and my experiences, both professional and personal, but also to sort of shift from this individual response to suicide where our only response is around, well, we need to help you clinically, mm-hmm. to part of the problem of suicide is a community issue. So we need community-based solutions as well. So it's been a really honor to serve in that role and to work with so many people on this.
Yeah, and so along those lines, if you feel comfortable talking about it, what is your personal relationship? Like, did you have some personal family members who?
So we've had some extended family members who have struggled and who have died by suicide. My most sort of the one that had the biggest impact on me was right after sort of high school. Around the same year, we had, my group of friends had two people die. And one of our good friends died by suicide, and another friend died in a motorcycle accident. And it was incredibly difficult. Like, it was devastating. Both of these deaths, were so devastating to me. And at the same time, I saw how differently they were treated, how differently they were attended to, how we were able to, grieve openly around the person who died in a motorcycle accident. But there was all of this sort of hushness and let's not talk about it, and this is, push it under the rug stuff, around our friend who died by suicide, and that, was hard, and there was not a lot of support given around it. There was not a lot of place to go to find like out any information or anything like that. So that was really striking to me about how far we needed to go, how sort of how much change needed to happen so that people didn't have to feel shame or stigma, or like they couldn't talk about it or be pushed into the corners when these experiences happen. Because what people need most in that moment is support.
Yeah,
and
I
to
agree.
talk about it.
And I can tell you, it's like personally, I went to Skyline right over here,
Yeah.
and I knew 3 kids who killed themselves, and it was like the school, they had little memorials for these kids in the yearbook, but it's like the school really did not want to talk about it, and it seemed totally obvious to me that there were other deaths, um, car accidents and things like that, and those were where you have a moment of silence and you recognize them, and then when they have the suicide, they want to pretend like it didn't really happen so that it doesn't spread. Do you think that's the best type of way of, by having school officials ignore that it happened, that, to have other students not repeat it and like it happened in Harriman? Is what's the best protocol to take?
No, I mean, I think definitely ignoring it is not the right approach. One of the things that we talk a lot about with schools is having a pre-thought out policy and sort of strategy for how you deal with student deaths at all, and treat every student death the same. So it doesn't matter if it's the most popular kid in school. It doesn't matter if it was a car accident. It doesn't matter if it was a suicide. Like, let's honor and treat all of these with an equal amount of sort of dignity and respect and grief. And so, yes, we talk about it. The school is a place that's a learning environment. So you certainly don't want to, overextend, big memorials. You want kids to feel comfortable and safe coming to school to learn, but you don't want to ignore it. So there's a delicate balancing act. And frankly, I think we in the field of suicide prevention need to do a better job at explaining that balancing act, because I think the fear of this idea of spreading it keeps people silent. So we have to talk a little bit more about, like, it's important that we talk about it, and yes, how we talk about it matters.
And is there a protocol in place that you, I mean, you said that you need to be delicate in the balancing act because you don't want to aggrandize it in any manner, but at the same time you want to respect that the students are suffering who are the good friends of the person who committed suicide. So how do you do that? Is that something that the state can tell schools, or is that something that schools have to figure out for themselves?
Yeah, I mean, luckily there are good resources on there. So national organizations like the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention and the Trevor Project and others have come together and put a toolkit, so after a suicide toolkit for schools that has sort of sample policies, procedures, and language. But, one of the things that so one example of how we would, advise schools or work with schools during or right after a loss is to say, you get in touch with the family, and you have to respect the family wishes. But as if the family is willing to share that the student died by suicide, that their child died by suicide, then you really have to explain that to the students, that sometimes, just like any other organ in your body, your brain malfunctions or gets sick. And sometimes when that happens, it says stuff to you like people would be better off without you, or you would be better off dead. And that's not true. We're not better off without you. You're not better off dead, but your brain will tell you that. And so if your brain is telling you that, you need to come talk to somebody. Tell somebody, let us help connect you to the right supports. And you have to be prepared to embrace those students and take them in when they do step forward and say that. So it really is this idea of like, the idea of human suffering, or the idea of, man, I can't do this anymore, that's pretty common, right? We
Yeah.
almost all experience that in some level at some time, and that's okay. What we don't want is for you to sit with that by yourself and let it sort of, eat away at you and convince you that it's true, because sometimes things aren't true, right? That your brain tells you, and that's the nature of sort of us being humans. So just to be prepared to talk about it in a way that's compassionate, that's based in fact, right? And then be prepared to sort of wrap around those extra supports for students.
Yeah. And so when we look at this on the national level, we see that just in the last 20 years, there's been about a 25% increase in the suicide rate. It could be in the next decade the leading cause of death in the United States. Why do you believe we're having this increase in suicide rates?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think that there's a lot of research going on trying to figure that out. One of the things that happened where we started sort of seeing the increases, more significantly, was around the, sort of Great Recession that we experienced. And um, so what we've seen in other times is that with economic downturns, you do see sort of an increase in suicides, right? Sort of breeds some despair and hopelessness and sense of burdensomeness, and these things that all sometimes contribute to thinking about suicide or acting on those thoughts. What's less clear is now, with sort of that seemingly behind us, where we have improving economies, low unemployment, and those kinds of things, that it hasn't leveled off or gone down in the way that trends would suggest. So that's the question: is what is going on? And I think that what the research is showing is there are some things about things like access to care, some things about the sort of maybe a lack of upward mobility in sort of people's economic abilities, that there are things like social media or use of technology that, instead of sort of, I think one of the points of it is to help us connect more widely, has actually led us to be a little more disconnected. It turns out that, like, talking to somebody face to face is really different than connecting with somebody over the internet. Like, different things happen in your brain and your body. And so it shouldn't be a substitute for in-person contact. It can be an add-on. But we think that there's probably some of that's gone on.
And so the big challenge I can see with your position is that, I mean, they try to find out what are the causes, and you want to look at statistics and the health of the economy and jobs and things like that, and you want to believe that hopefully it's like some kind of material problem, because material problems can be easily solved and recognized. But could it be that it's just more of a spiritual problem, that people are more disconnected not only from each other but from nature and their higher power, and that we are becoming, because we are becoming more material and materialistic in our goals and dreams, ambitions, things like that? Could it be that's a big cause of it? Is the state looking at that as a possibility, or is that kind of out of the context of how you discuss it?
No, I mean, if I were, to choose this one thing that I think would make the biggest difference, it is around creating social connections and in breaking down, people's experiences of loneliness and, not feeling like a part of something. And so I do think that that has to be part of the strategy. It's something where it's one of the examples that I think shows very clearly that this is not a problem that's going to be solved solely by state government or local government, right? It's something where we have to bring everyone to the table, because some there's some things that state government can do, and there's some things that state government can do. And it turns out that government isn't always good at like increasing social connections or some of those more sort of things around intimacy or making sure that you actually are connected with somebody in a way that's meaningful, not just like I see you passing by. And so that's something that we have to be a part of. But, so one of the things that we have done is we have a faith-based task force. And so we have a group of faith leaders from all sorts of denominations, backgrounds, who have come together and are putting together a lot of strategies for engaging faith leaders, faith communities in suicide prevention. And we know that, the data shows us that when people are, religion or faith sort of communities tend to protect against suicide. Where that doesn't happen is when somebody feels rejected or, othered by a faith group. And so how do we make sure that othering, that sort of rejection doesn't happen, that people can find safe spaces, that faith, places of faith, places of worship are, radically inclusive, so that people can find those, connections, those sense of purpose, that sense of community, that place to lean on when things get tough. And so that is a really important piece, but it is going to take more than just state government working on it. We have to partner with all sorts of groups to tackle those things that you sort of mentioned, right?
Yeah, I want to talk about something when we get back. In a recent statistic, they did a poll and they found out that more people gain more happiness from a sense of community than they do by just their income alone. Mm-hmm. And so when we get back, we'll talk about that. Sounds and we'll be back in a minute. This episode of the Utah Stories podcast is brought to you by our Made in Utah gift boxes. Now, we haven't really promoted these as much as we probably should have, but we have 30 of these awesome Bath and Body boxes where it's all coming from local makers. These are bath salts, that's lotion. We have this awesome Japanese cherry blossom soap, and another soap that's pumpkin spice. These soaps, unlike the soaps you buy at the grocery store, they smell of like these fruity, wonderful, delicious flavors. Like you almost want to eat them. They smell so good. So you have to like prevent yourself from eating them while you're scrubbing your body with them. Just don't eat them. They're not good for you. But we've also got these bath bombs. We've got these salves. All of this stuff in here. So all this stuff you see here, we're selling online on sale right now for $25 on madeinutahfest.com. Okay. So I wanted to go into what's known as the suicide belt. I mean, there's been a lot of national coverage now. The Wall Street Journal just did a story 2 weeks ago about harem in Utah. And what we kind of get into with the magazine, with Utah Stories magazine, is we report on how communities are often strong when they're made up of locally owned businesses, when people take ownership over the architecture, the businesses, the streets. And then when you get further out in the suburbs, you find more ubiquitous chain stores, lack of walkable destinations, lack of green space, open space, and kind of less community. Is that looked at as any kind of a factor in the high suicide rates we find in Utah?
I mean, if you look based on sort of geographic um, breakdown. What you will find is that, like in Utah, and this is true of sort of our surrounding states, is that more urban centers have lower rates of suicide
Yeah, and across the country too.
across the country.
The higher the density of population, the lower the rate of suicide, which is kind of surprising.
Yeah, and so once you get out into really sort of rural Utah, you have higher rates of suicide, and um, it's it's interesting because you'll go into a small community and there is this sense of we know each other, we take care of each other. But there are some additional challenges around we know each other and we know everything about each other,
Yeah.
right? Or there's some of that kind of stuff that,
Yeah.
that where people feel like they can't reach out for help because everybody will know, right? There's just like one mental health center on Main Street, and if I park my car there, everyone's going to know that's my, so
Yeah.
so there are some challenges I think culturally around. One of the things about this Rocky Mountain region is, the sort of Wild West, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, rugged individualism sort of culture that this was built on, which was like really great if you're, pulling a wagon across the country, across that terrain. But when you have depression or an addiction or you're just going through a really extreme life crisis, like it's not as useful of a strategy. And so, sort of disconnecting from that to say like it's okay to ask for help and help is good and we should support each other, you know. So yeah, I mean definitely, rurality versus suburban versus urban seems to play a role. Figuring out exactly what that is something that we're trying to do now. Is it around the lack of economic opportunity in rural areas? Is it around all younger generations from rural communities really fleeing into more suburban and rural areas, so you don't have that intergenerational connection that you might find in other places? Is it that there's just such easy access to handguns that during, or guns in general, that during a crisis people are more likely to die than they are if they, have a crisis somewhere else and don't have access to a gun? Is it lack of services? So there is a lot to sort of unpack on. Is it around sort of walkability to places? So I think there's a lot to unpack around that, but we know strategies have to be, like prevention strategies have to be adapted to the local environment and be responsive.
If you look at one common factor, I don't know if you guys go so far as breaking down each individual suicide case, but if you break down the different cases and you look at one overriding factor that's common among most of them, what would you say it is?
So when we look at, we do a lot of sort of data collection and analysis, and sometimes it sounds, cold to talk about suicide in such a data sort of driven way. I try to think of it as, when we get the best data we can and we use it to inform prevention, that's, one way that we can honor somebody's life who died by suicide, is by, hopefully helping learn better ways to help other people who are experiencing similar conditions. But one common theme is like a crisis in a relationship in the past 2 weeks. So we know that that's very common. So if somebody's having a significant relationship crisis, an underlying mental health or substance use disorder is, or some sort of, contributing mental health issue definitely is a factor, but it isn't the only factor, and that's something to sort of highlight because I think historically it's just been seen as a mental health problem. And again, we're like, well, it's not just mental health. There's other things going on, like these, relationship crises, like people going through really stressful times and needing either additional skills to manage it or additional supports to help get through it. And we also know that like a lot of people are getting some sort of like care, healthcare, or behavioral health care, and that we have to improve the care that we're offering to people who are at risk for suicide. It's a pretty young science in terms of how do you best prevent it in a clinical setting. And so we have to try to keep up with that and learn and grow and adapt our care settings to be more responsive.
And it seems like that's the one thing the government could do that would make a big difference is it was pointed out in one of the articles I read that the lack of mental health care in the suicide belt, Idaho, Wyoming, Utah, Nevada, is pretty common among all those states.
Hmm.
And then, like you said, a stigma attached to reaching out,
Right.
because especially in small towns. But is part of your job to increase the accessibility and detach the stigma that's common to seeking out mental health care
Oh,
related to suicide?
absolutely. Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, so we actually have, a bunch of goals and a bunch of strategies, but our three core goals at the state level are around improving quality of and access to care for people who are at risk for suicide. And the other is sort of shifting what we call in public health social norms around help seeking. So if you broke your arm and it really hurt and it was kind of dangling a little bit, what would you do?
Go to a doctor.
Go to a doctor, right? Again, back to that idea is if your brain is telling you that you would be better off dead, a lot of people just sit with that. And so, how do we shift the norm to be like, oh, that's a clue? Just like if I break my arm, to go to the doctor, to go
Hmm.
see somebody, to go get support, to, whoever that might be, find somebody who can sort of link you in with whatever the best supports for each person's case is going to be. So, how do we shift social norms to be more supportive of help seeking?
Hmm.
And then our third is around, reducing access to lethal means, which is around reducing access to opioids or other medications and firearms when somebody is going through a difficult life situation, or is in crisis. So, yeah, those are the three areas that we think we can have a significant impact on, and that if we work with local communities and various stakeholders, that there's real opportunity for prevention, for lives to be saved.
Yeah, well, that's great. And just talking a little bit more about how Utah was recently in the spotlight, um, related to this Wall Street Journal article, we they wrote about Chandler Charles Vutaz, who was a 17-year-old who killed himself in Harriman, and then five other teenagers in Harriman, um, not long after he did it, killed themselves also. And he was like a model student, um, almost straight A's, and just it looked like he had such a bright future. I mean, just really not the stereotypical idea you'd have in your mind for somebody who would want to kill themselves. But then you find people like Anthony Bourdain, who killed himself, and Kate Spade, and people who really are looked at as very successful top achievers. What do you think is happening when people who are really top achievers and who are model citizens end up killing themselves? And then why do you believe these other students uh, in Harriman followed suit after?
I mean, I think what the lessons of people who we feel like don't fit the mold, right, tells us that there is no mold. Um, none of us are immune, and that's why it has to be an ongoing open conversation, and that we think about sort of things in place or in sort of advance. We be proactive about this as opposed to sort of waiting until there are crises. So, how do we talk to kids about, sometimes things might happen that make you feel like you don't want to live anymore? What is one thing you could do during that time? Who is somebody you can call? Right? There's an app, for example, called My3, which prompts people to go in, and you can say, here's when I know that like things aren't going well. Here are the signs that tell me things aren't going well. Stop wanting to hang out with my friends, or I don't want to talk to my parents about A, B, or C, right? So I identify what those are, and then I say, what can I do to help sort of manage my, big emotions, right? What are things that I can do? Is it listen to music? What kind of music? Go for a run? Like, what is it that I can do to sort of help activate my skills that help me manage, these tough times? And then who do I reach out to for help? And
Mm-hmm.
if, these things aren't working, where do I turn to? So things like the Safe UT app, which is an app every kid can download on their phone and chat with a crisis worker um, up at the U, who is, a trained clinician, trained crisis worker, who can just help support them and give ideas and talk about, what are what are other things you can do besides acting on maybe these thoughts, or call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, or access these kinds of emergency services. So how do we be proactive and talk about that in a meaningful way? um,
Well, I mean, the question is, though, why would now people who are on such a path of perfection, who realize a little defeat, be the ones who end up killing themselves? I mean, is that a question that you ask at the state level, or is that just kind of beyond the scope of? Because I just kind of wonder about this one case with Chandler. How, like, what happened there? I mean, in your eyes, in Harriman, why did he do that, and then why did so many other students follow suit? Is that something you have any kind of?
I mean, obviously, I don't think any of us can assume to know what was going on in any single individual's mind in that moment,
Did he
And
leave any kind of letter, or did any of those students leave letters? Yeah.
I mean, so about a third of people leave notes. They're not usually all that helpful in understanding this
Yeah.
question, right? Because they're often written during a time of intense crisis.
Yeah.
And or it's not it's not often a logical mind. A mind in crisis is hyper focused on a problem, is, closed off to solution. Problem solving is very difficult. Like, these are all what we know about a mind in crisis. And so it's hard to evaluate something as huge as taking one's own life based on sort of logic.
Yeah,
Because
I
it's not a
suppose so.
logical time, it's not a rational mind. And so, how do we engage people during those times, help people, self recognize that, help people, protect people when they are in that state of crisis, and provide sort of whatever is needed to get through that crisis, or to sort of alleviate the pain people are experiencing. But
Yeah.
it isn't something, that we can understand from logic or ration, or
Yeah, I
those
guess you're
things.
right. I guess I had a friend in high school who was in my group of friends who did it, we just all looked for any kind of logical reason why. I mean, he had everything anybody could possibly need or
Mm-hmm.
want, and I guess your mind is made in a way where you try to find the answers, and that's just
Yeah.
there's not a clear answer other than that person didn't get the help they were seeking. And
I think one of the things we look to is, we have a lot of people around our table helping with suicide prevention efforts who have the experience of having thought seriously about suicide, or having had made a suicide attempt,
mm-hmm.
and can inform based on that lived experience,
Yeah.
and who tell us a lot. I mean, the most common thing is, it's not that I wanted to die. I just didn't know how to live with the pain I was experiencing, with the crisis I was experiencing, with the situation I was in. And sometimes, there's a somebody who shared their story about when he was a teenager and he had a serious suicide attempt. And one of the big drivers was he had like crashed his parents' car, and he was like, they're going to be so, this kind of perfectionism thing, they're going to be so upset.
Mm-hmm.
And in that sort of crisis thinking, he was able to believe that his parents would be more upset if they found out that he crashed their car and they had to replace it. Like, he didn't understand insurance, he said.
Mm.
More upset about that than upset about losing their son.
Yeah.
That's not rational, right?
Mm-hmm.
This one of the themes that we hear from people who have been there say, I feel like I was a burden, like people would be better off without me. Yet I sit, daily with people who have lost their loved ones to suicide. And that's not true. They're not better off without that person, even if there was a lot of challenges going on in their relationship or in their person's life. So again, it's challenging this notion that people believe that, and how do we as a community, as a family, as a coworker, as whoever it is, like, make sure that we're consistently reaching out and embracing people and letting people know, like, their life matters and they're worth something and we need them here.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's great. That's good advice. And we'll have one more short segment after this. We're going to take a short break. In the next segment, we'll talk about wellness and what everybody can do to help prevent suicide in Utah. All right. This episode of the Utah Stories program is brought to you by Made in Utah Festivals. So we just had our amazing beer fest at the Gateway. It was a huge success. It was our Brewers Fest. We'll show you a few photos from that. You can visit our Instagram and Facebook page if you participated. Some of the negative comments we've received about the festival regard the size of the lines. So we were unprepared that everyone would be showing up who had tickets either before or right when the event started. I want to personally apologize for that. We should have had a few more people in place, a few more resources. I appreciate everybody who realized that if they came earlier, they came, the beginning, the first hour, they were going to wait in line. It was an awesome event, and I really appreciate all the amazing vendors. Most of the breweries completely sold out of their products. I can tell you the winner of our audience poll for Best New Brewery was Cerveza Zulupez. Javier at Cerveza Zulupez won Best New Brewery. He's out of Ogden, and I highly recommend you go try his brewery. And thank you, everyone, for coming. I appreciate it. So our next Made in Utah festival, mark your calendar, is August 23rd and 24th at the Gateway. Be sure to come out. It'll be 2 days. We'll have probably about 150 vendors. It's going to be a massive party. So hope to see you there. We'll talk now a little bit about how we best prevent suicide, how we improve our mental health and well-being, so that especially the younger folks and I guess the highest suicide rate is among men in their 40s. How we all basically practice wellness. It's our wellness month at Utah Stories. It's our wellness issue in order to prevent those thoughts and feelings and have more of the mechanisms in place so that we reduce the suicide rate in Utah. What would you suggest is the most important? What are the three most important factors to stay in a good mental space to prevent that from happening?
So, three most important factors. I mean, that's a good question. I think. I mean, I can say personally, you know, so I think there's three things that I do is I go to therapy, and sometimes it's responsive to a problem and sometimes it's preventive, right? It's to constantly check in on my thoughts, check in on my emotions, check in on how I feel like I'm relating to others. And so, engaging in meaningful sort of wellness practices, whether that be, somebody doing yoga, I go to therapy, whatever it might be, right?
Mm-hmm.
So being proactively engaged in your mental health would be one, I would say. Two, for me, again, like physical exercise is really important. It is a space where I feel like I'm taking care of myself. I'm doing something good for myself. And it, does a lot of the things, the endorphins, the things that help us feel good. So that's one for me. And then spending disconnected, grounded, meaningful time with people I care about.
Mm-hmm.
So not checking phones, not checking emails, not getting on the computer. Like for me, it helps being outside. It helps, one of my sort of go-tos is this idea that I heard from somebody that is around like when in doubt, tether yourself to something real, right? So whether that be nature, whether that be a person you care about, whatever that be, but something that is real, not something that's virtual or other, like that. And so I find that's sort of my mantra is around tethering. So I think everybody has to find that for themselves. If I had like a system wish, one of the things that I wish was that we started much like we do annual physicals or well child checks. We do these preventative check-ins on our physical health. I wish that as a system we would build in mental health checks into that, because I think one of the challenges is that we don't think about mental health until something's going wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And then the system is hard to navigate. And so if we had somebody that we knew, that we had checked in with over the years, and we know that that would be our like entrance point into okay, now what do I do? I think that that could help us all be a little more able to navigate the system.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's great advice. I think I find for myself that if you do your own personal mental health check, and you're like, okay, my headspace is kind of getting into a negative territory, and then, like you said, be proactive about it. What am I going to do about it now? And it's because I feel like a lot of times thoughts and feelings spiral downward just naturally. Like they'll just continue to go down until you're like in a really bad space, unless you take control and do something about it.
Yeah.
And I think so. If there's if there are anybody listening or watching right now who happens to be feeling isolated, feeling like there's no way out, what would you say are the best solutions to prevent the downward spiral effect?
One of my favorite analogies that I have a good friend and mentor who says is like, if you're in that dark place, like if your brain is taking you there, it's like a bad neighborhood, right? Don't go there alone. Take someone with you, right? So reach out and do it as many times as you need to find somebody who will engage with you, right? A lot of this is about just being heard, being listened to, knowing that your experience is valuable. So reach out, find someone who will be there for you and can help you sort of navigate now what. Because the now what can be different for everybody. Some people might just need someone to talk to, or someone to just sit in their pain with them for a little while. And someone might need ongoing treatment, right? And so the what now is different for everybody. But like if your mind is in that bad place, don't navigate it alone. Reach out. You're worth that. You're not alone. We're here for you. And if you can't find anybody right now, please call, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. If you're in Utah, that'll answer up at the U, and you'll get really great people who can listen and help connect to next steps and resources. And that number is 1-800-273-8255.
1-800-273-8255. All right. All right, that's great advice. Yeah, well, thanks so much, Kim Myers, for being on the show. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Thanks for listening to the Utah Stories Show. My name is Richard Markosian. I'm the editor and publisher of Utah Stories. If you'd like to help us grow this program, you can do it in one of three ways. One, and this is probably the most important thing, if you could share this program with a few people who are your friends or your family, that's probably the best way. Number two, if you want to be informed about all of our future episodes and new episodes, go to utahstories.com and subscribe to our newsletter. Or number three, and I promise you this will be up and working this week. We've had a few problems with it. Subscribe to Utah Stories magazine and have the magazine sent to your home every single month, delivered right to your door. It requires no electricity, no operating system or updates. It's actually printed on paper, and it's really a great read. So thanks for watching. Have a good day.